Recently, I got a phone call from a really good friend of mine. So we've been friends. He's 2 months younger than I am. So we've been friends basically our whole lives. And his grandmother had passed away. And, I remember her from growing up. We've been friends for a really long time. And, he called me and we were talking, and I, went to send something, so I live in Boston, he lives in Pennsylvania, and I went to send something, and was shocked to discover the lack of options, for sending a sympathy box, to a man. So a lot of them for women, great, lots of options online. But for men, it was kind of like, these like manly options, which didn't really fit him, didn't also fit like the vibe that I was really going for, right? Like, I'm so sorry, your grandmother passed away. Here's beef jerky hearts. Like, it just didn't like all kind of like correlate for me.
And not, you've sent beef jerky hearts.
I have.
So it's nothing against that. It's just,
it just wasn't the time. And, but I also didn't want to send him like a whole quart of soup. Like, he lives by himself, right? So, I was able to kind of like figure out what to send, but, we were texting back and forth, and, it makes me think about some of the stuff that we talked about on here, which is, sending text messages and telling him like, he doesn't have to respond. If, like, I know that there's so much going on. They're planning a funeral. And, it's interesting to me, like, his journey was so different than mine because he didn't caregive. So it's an unfortunate story that I think probably happens to a lot of people, which is his grandmother fell.
Mm-hmm. She was fine. Her husband, his grandfather, lived together independently, had just gotten home from dinner.
And she fell. And she went into the hospital, and there were complications from the surgery, and passed away very quickly. It was a very quick, and in some ways there's a thought there that she didn't suffer, right? That like it did happen quickly, that there wasn't like a long drawn out process. I don't know that that's good or bad, to be honest with you.
It's like, just different.
It's just different. Yeah. There wasn't really time to kind of come to terms with this happy, healthy person went from being happy and healthy and going out to dinner and doing all of these things to now not there.
Mm-hmm.
And so how do you support somebody through that? And, I also remember him texting about like if he was going to do the eulogy or not. So for those of you that don't know, I shared parts of the eulogy that I did for my nan in one of the very first episodes. And, I think a eulogy is so hard. It is hard to do, but I think it's one of those things that you should be sure. Like, either it's something that you feel like you're supposed to do and want to do, and you feel that conviction to kind of stand up there and say goodbye, and you feel like you need it as part of your grief process, or I don't think you do. And, I could be wrong. But for me, it feels like one of those either or things.
Well, and I think in your situation, that's the blessing of caregiving. We talk a lot in here about how hard it is, and but that's the blessing of caregiving, is that you were ready for it. He was in a very different situation. He was still reeling with the surprise of all of it, and hadn't had those years of watching a decline and grappling with, that decline and what that meant. I can tell you many nights, I would drive home from my mom's and I would cry the whole way. And this is, 10 years before she, passed away. This was just dealing with what I knew was coming. And how hard it was. And, he didn't get that. And so I think, if you are caregiving, I think in some moments we can be thankful for the time that we have. And some of that is the time to grieve the loss, even while somebody is alive, as we see them decline and know where we're going. Where in his situation, his gran was totally independent, and he could interact with her and play cards and have fun, and all of that's wonderful, but never, had to deal with, what if she's not here? And of course, given her age, she was in her late 80s, I'm sure that crossed people's mind, but not in the same way as when it's smacked in front of you, you're rushing somebody to the ICU, to the ER, and they end up in ICU, or, all of the bouts that we had with Nana. So.
Right. And, so today on the Hey Woman podcast, so it is dedicated to my Nan. I'm here with my mom, Julie, and we're going to talk about caregiving. And we're going to talk about the caregiving that he's entering into. So my friend, because even though his grandfather is still able-bodied, still very much in good health, good spirits, he can go out, he can do things. We talk a lot about medical caregiving. And so today I want to spend a little bit of time talking about social caregiving, because I think sometimes that happens first. And that's what happened first with Nan, when her husband passed away in 2010. Gosh, like you don't realize like how long it is. I was going into 9th grade, that summer, and, I don't think I would have called it caregiving. But even my life, changed a little bit. I spent more time out at Nan's, and the time was different because it wasn't about Pap, and he was sick.
She had caregive for him. Yeah,
she had.
But, all that caregiving, then when it's gone, there's a loneliness, there's a void, so. And that's what he's going to deal with his grandfather is going to need him now in a way, or his family now in a way that they didn't before, because, he had his wife and they were together and he wasn't by himself. And they had a routine of going out to dinner. And, you see him, I go to the same church they go to often and see them coming in on a Sunday morning, holding hands. And so, he or somebody in the family is going to really have to help fill some of that void for their grandfather, and his own health, and being able to really be there and in a way that they haven't had to before.
Yeah, and so I think, what I want people to start to think about is, social caregiving is kind of like the first step of, they can still be able-bodied, but maybe they're lonely, or, their life just doesn't look the way that it used to. And there is a change that happens in your life. And so, my grandfather passed away from dementia, my dad's dad, and he goes and visits my gram every Wednesday. And
more often, but for sure every Wednesday.
Right. And so, but the every Wednesday thing is nice because, one, my gram knows that it's happening. So if there's stuff like around her house that maybe my pap would have fixed, or that she's not sure what to do, or she gets something in the mail that she's nervous about, she knows that she can set it down and she can wait until Wednesday and she can talk to my dad about it. It's also nice from the perspective of, if we're trying to do things with my dad, we know on Wednesdays he's going with Graham. And
I even have my work life kind of centered around that. I have to go one day a week to an office that's farther away from my main office, and it's in State College. It takes me about an hour and 15, hour and a half to drive home, and so I choose to go on Wednesdays, knowing that he's going to be down there anyways, and so that we'll just eat a little later that night. And so, I think part of what we're saying to everybody, if you're listening, is having some continuity, some consistency. Like, here's the plan. Every Wednesday he's going to go down. That's helpful. It's helpful for her, like you said, but it's also helpful for me as his spouse, because then I know that's going to happen. And please know that doesn't mean the only time, but I think sometimes what happens is, if we go back to the situation that just happened, that whole family is going to have to kind of decide who's visiting when, like have discussions about that. And that's hard. There's 4 children in that family. They might not be used to interacting a lot. They might be. But what we don't want to do is have everybody visit for the next month and then it trails off, right, and he's by himself. And so they do need a plan. And, and again, in, my husband's family, it's more likely that his one sister will do something for Sunday dinner, so again, she's not at home alone. And, and my mother-in-law is totally independent, but loneliness is a big thing. It doesn't matter what study we look at, what we see, loneliness is something we really have to combat. And, living in Pennsylvania, Winter was really bad this year. And, that makes people lonely because they get kind of stuck at home. A lot of people are scared to go out and fall. Falling's a big deal. In your opening story, you talked about somebody that fell. I remember when Nana fell and broke her hip. I can vividly remember standing in a hallway at the hospital and just sobbing to Verla Acker, who runs the admissions at a personal care home I own, but is also a really good friend of mine, because I know what it means that when somebody falls, sometimes they're not able to get back to where they were. The amount of people who die within a year of falling is just astronomical. I see it time and time again. I think, in this situation, I think it's important that families do think about how do we combat loneliness, which is, kind of your point of this social caregiving, and just how important that is.
And I think, for some people, they think oh, well, I'll just bring them when I go do things. Mm-hmm. And that is so much easier said than done.
It sounds good on a Sunday when you're planning your week. Yeah, it does.
It does. And I'm not saying don't do it, but I would say to you that you're being a little naive if you don't think that it adds a layer of complexity to it. One, like we've shared in this podcast before, is your parents, your grandparents, these aging adults, maybe it's just an us thing, but they have opinions.
They do, yeah.
And so when you go to add them to things, you add their opinions. They also... Rightly so. Right. And I'm not saying that we don't want their opinions. I don't know that I want all 10 of them, but, they have their opinions. They also have their schedules and different things like that.
And if people are new to the podcast, these are real conversations about love and caregiving. And we totally loved my mom, but the kind of why we're laughing is that Nana came with, who we used to go into her apartment and say, "Hey woman, how are you?" That's how this all came about. But some of this you have to laugh at or you'll cry. She came with a lot of opinions.
She did. If you were going to town, takes 15 minutes. You were leaving a half an hour early. That's just that's what she wanted. She thought it took a half an hour. Doesn't take me a half an hour to get there.
But it should have taken you a half an hour if you had driven appropriately, for goodness sakes.
20 minutes.
It took my husband, your dad, 20 minutes, a half an hour, and DJ, and they were better drivers. So
she preferred them because they operated under her schedule, but I could get there in 15 to 20 minutes. So, and if you told her that you were leaving at 8:00, at 7:55, she was sitting outside waiting for you.
Yes.
So
on her walker. Yes. Yeah.
Happy to add her to things, and I'm glad that we did. But it does come with complications. I also think, the walker is such a good point, because she had a walker, but she was still, when she had her walker, she had a drop foot. And so it really was a lot for stabilization, so to avoid the falling, more so than she really, really needed it to move herself. But, having a walker and trying to take somebody out to dinner becomes a complicated thing if they have to go to the bathroom.
Yes, because not all bathrooms are made for walkers or wheelchairs.
And not all parking lots and parking situations. So we're lucky to live in a rural area where it's very restaurants have parking lots. That's, it wouldn't be hard to find one, I guess is what I would say, that would have a parking spot with a handicap accessible thing that we could, could get her in and out of the car easy. But if you live in a major city, you're not we're recording this podcast in New York City. She's not coming into New York City and walking 10 blocks to go shopping anymore,
Well, and even, in caregiving for her, maneuvering your guys' graduations were hard. Your graduation from Northeastern and then Steffi's graduation from American. It added a layer of complexity because of her mobility issues.
Right.
Where are you going to park? How do I get her into there? Even the dinner. I remember when we did the dinner for her, I just made some assumptions that there would be an ability to get her wheelchair there. But the dinner in DC afterwards, we had to kind of figure out, like, okay, how do we get her up to that second floor? And there was a way, but it was a roundabout way. And all of that becomes really difficult. I don't know if you remember that after dinner, somebody stole her wheelchair.
Yes.
Do you remember that?
Yeah, after Steph's graduation.
Oh my goodness! They didn't steal it. That's but they took her wheelchair. They took the wrong wheelchair home. So we were at a restaurant, and they took Nan's wheelchair because in a city, the wheelchair is not going to be with you because there's not enough space. So he took it someplace. Well, when we went to leave, they gave us a wheelchair, and I was like, that's not the right wheelchair. And it was a big deal because she was a littler person, and the wheelchair was for a bigger person. And I'm not sure how the bigger person got into our little one, or why that other family didn't notice that this was the wrong wheelchair, but they didn't. And that was a huge issue. So again, I think the whole point here is that in caregiving, it's just going to take longer. It's more opinions in the beginning, but then it's also more maneuvering as they decline, and you have to think through things that and even when you think through them, things are going to come up. To the credit of the restaurant, they went and got the wheelchair, and were able to switch it. And, so they totally took care of it, and they were wonderful about it. But we were leaving like the next day after the graduation.
Right. And so I think, this whole social aspect of caregiving, when people think about caregiving, they think about, medication management and doctor's appointments and dentists and like all of that stuff.
And showering. And like the activities of daily living, eating, dressing, showering. But yeah, we're really talking about connectedness and loneliness. And again, I think this is such an important thing. If you read, the blue zones, we talk about people's longevity. It is being socially connected. I've actually done a TEDx talk about this in Alzheimer's, about how we as a society lose connectedness, and that really spurs our aging and our decline. And again, if we go back to the beginning story of this, where your friend lost his grandmother, and the caregiving now is to make sure that grandfather doesn't get isolated, isn't lonely, and stays socially connected. Or what's going to happen is, he's going to go downhill himself. And so that's something that people really have to think about, the visiting, the taking them places, although it's going to take longer and there's more opinions, but that it's really, really important.
It is. And I think just being like open and honest about these kinds of things, like even, to take Nan somewhere, we really had to be strategic about what vehicle we were taking places.
Yes.
And sometimes that meant that we were driving two vehicles, because we didn't all fit in one. And she could only get in and out of certain ones, even if she was really well. Just for the people that are listening, my dad and my brother both drive trucks. And so even when she could maneuver, getting her like hoisted up into my dad's truck or my uncle's truck is a complicated thing, right?
Well, yeah, and I kept her car for years because I was driving a Jeep at the time, and she couldn't get into that either.
Right. So I think, even if even these smaller things, even when she was more able-bodied, getting her into a truck would have been complicated. She was just a little woman. And so, I think people just need to, think about like where they're at and how it fits in. And it might just take 10 or 15 minutes of calling ahead and doing some planning and different things like that. But I also think this is where, like, before the things get more complicated and more medical, you can really see like how your family's going to work together, and who's going to kind of like, step up and start spearheading some of this. Because there's also the whole conversation about like food and different things like that. We did a whole episode on food when Nan like moved into the village, but, and I don't know who of the two of them, of my friend's grandparents, like did most of the cooking. But it wouldn't be uncommon in that generation for his grandfather to not have done a lot of the cooking. And so even just dropping off food that he can reheat. Now you lose some of the social connectedness, but if you can't take him out to every meal. And so we talk about, bringing this person into your social life and kind of what you're doing and adding them on to major lifetime moments or Sunday night dinners. But I think you also have to take a step back, and there's a give and a take here too with, they could have been people that every Thursday night they went out to dinner and they went to the same place. And I think especially in the beginning, making it so that somebody goes with him and he keeps a part of that is really important, because you're talking about a loss into the grief process. Not changing everything all at once is also really important. So I think there's a give and a take with the social aspect of adding them to your life is a really great way to kind of add a social component that just takes a little bit more maneuvering but might feel a little bit easier. But you have to be kind of aware of all of the social things that they are losing. And so navigating that and making it so that they can still do some of them, and having people take turns.
Yeah, absolutely. What we know, or what I know, being an elder law attorney, is that particularly when the wife dies first, he'll either be remarried or he'll pass away, in the next few years. And so that companionship is something that, they were married like over 60 years. I think it was like 66 years. That's something he's really used to. And so we really have to be thinking about that. I think the other thing that for people to be thinking about, and we think about caregiving, is, his decision now. Not that he has to make it right now, but it's something that does have to be made about whether or not he'll age at home. And most people, if you ask them, there's studies that say 75%, so there's studies that say 85%. Definitely the desire to stay at home and age has increased since COVID. But is he gonna age in place? And that's one of the things that if he says, well, I'm going to stay here in the house, then we have to think about, well, in order for him to stay in the house, what needs to be done if he were to decline? So we think about falls. So getting rid of rugs that people can trip over. That was a big one for Mom, but that's a big one throughout. Do we have the proper handrails for somebody to be able to go to the bathroom? Are the doorways going to be big enough for a walker or a wheelchair to get through them? So starting to think about okay, is now for him to continue to stay there, even though he doesn't have a diagnosis yet. He's still, but we know at some point in time he could decline. And if he says, my choice, and this is true of everybody, if your choice is to stay at home, then we have to think about, well, what is my home able to be something where I can age in place? I'm even thinking about that myself, as my husband and I decide, we've raised our kids, and where do we want to spend our next chapter of our lives? We live in an old farmhouse that I love. Is that where we're going to stay? We've talked about adding on, particularly a bedroom downstairs. So again, making those decisions. I think the other, and then this happened, we can relate this back to Nana. After my stepfather passed away, she was alone in a big old house, and she was still very socially connected. She still worked at my office at times, part-time. She still did a lot with you grandchildren. She was able to drive. But at the end of the day, she wasn't with him. And at some point in time, she started to decline a little bit. And it got lonely in that farmhouse. So that farmhouse that I remember her fighting so hard to keep through the divorce with my father. And that was just, not fighting him, but just the finances of it. I watched her just do everything she could to make sure we could keep that farmhouse. And we did. I don't know that I ever thought there'd be a time that she would leave it. And yet, and we talked about this in another episode, at some point in time, she had spent some respite time at Nipponos Valley Village, which is a personal care home. And she liked the social connectedness. At the time she moved there, she was independent. She was able to, drive around, do whatever she wanted. And then what happened is she aged in place there. So that's just something that is an option as we're dealing with this, as your friend deals with his grandfather. One option is, okay, let's say what's going to happen long term. We know right now we have to combat the loneliness. We have to socially be there with him and add things. But what happens down the road? Is it something that he's going to live in that house by himself? Or is he going to, want to move into some sort of community living? And there's a huge value to that. And it's the social connectedness. That's the huge value of that. It's funny, they even say now where many people are deciding to do what the Golden Girls was, like people living together. And part of that can be financially driven. But it's also part of that is just that socialization, which is caregiving.
It is. And so I think, it's a really great time to kind of talk about, we've been doing this podcast for about a year, and, we just touched on social caregiving. There's, obviously the medical, which is what we spend a good amount of time talking about on here, but, what is the status of caregiving in 2026, right? So, there's all these really great options, which is really great. A group of friends living together is caregiving, moving. I think, we've come so far. And, it's not this like linear process of, you live in your house, you get sick, you go into a nursing home and you pass away, right? Like that was kind of like the accepted trajectory. And now there's people that they're aging in place, or they're aging with loved ones, or, and a lot of this is culture driven too. Some cultures, they, just move people in with like younger generations, and that becomes this whole thing. But, really talking about, they're not building more nursing homes.
They are not in this country at all building more nursing homes. It's scary how few are being built at this point in time, given the how many people are aging. The first baby boomers, January 1st of this year, are turning 80. So you have this huge amount of people that are going to need care, and yet we're not putting money into the buildings themselves. And in this country right now, we're losing caregivers. So many of our caregivers in this country are immigrants, and those people are, not being able to maybe safely go to their jobs. There's certainly efforts to have people or groups of people who do compromise a lot of those caregivers being deported, or their protected status being taken away. And there's grave concerns about that, to the extent that there are states that are stepping in and saying, hey, we're not going to be able to provide care for our aging populations without these immigrant groups who provide such great care to our residents of our states through facilities or in-home caregivers. And so the state of care right now, we have just a lot more need for care, and a dwindling caregiver population. And I think that's important for people to know, because that's going to drive up the cost of care. It's also going to be in a situation where you're not going to be able to get care. And so it's going to have to be the family. Now, please note, a lot of care is already being provided by the family. Again, this podcast is a recognition that family caregiver needs help. Mm-hmm. It's a recognition of how can we help that person. But we could talk about, other options or hiring caregivers, and that may not be something that's possible in the future, because I think there's going to be more care needs than what there are caregivers.
Yeah, I mean, kind of like, how did we get here, and what are some of the statistics about it? So, we've looked up some different things, different studies that have been done by AARP, by, the Harvard Medical School, and different things like that. Unpaid caregivers provide over $1 trillion worth mm-hmm. of care annually.
Right.
So, I mean, that's not a little number, right? 28% of caregivers are immigrants.
Yeah, that's from the Center for Retirement Research at Boston College, 28%.
And that's paid.
Yes.
Those are so, the percentage of immigrants that are providing unpaid care isn't really a known number, but, they've done some studies and it is quite substantial. The birth rates, people aren't having as many kids. So, it's one thing, we live in I grew up and you still live in a really rural area. And it wasn't uncommon for me to know people who have 7, 8, 9 siblings. Well, you're caring for aging parents and there's 9 of you. You can really spread that out, right? Like you can, and even if one
Makes me glad I had at least 3 of you, right?
Right. Well, I mean, if you have 9 siblings and 2 of them are not helpful, there's still 7 of you. That's 1 a day, right? There's 3 of us. If 2 of us become unhelpful,
Yeah.
that's not so good. Now, luckily, I think, all 3 of us will pitch in our own way.
Also, you don't know what's going to happen in your guys' life. Like there could be one of you that's just not able.
Right.
Maybe they're caring for a child with a disability or their own spouse, you just don't know,
Right.
That anybody is going to be able, to step up to the plate when that's necessary. So I think there's a reality to that yes, some just don't, some just don't. And, it might be their own, mechanism of how they deal with it, but some just don't step up. But some can't, that there's something really going on in their life that doesn't allow that to happen, the room for it.
Well, it really kind of depends on where you're at in your life journey. Like if your parents are getting older and you just had a child, having a newborn and caring for an aging parent is very different than, having grown adult children that can also, step in and help. So much of the caregiving journey, like you said, it's not about if people want to help or don't want to help or, and as siblings, you can kind of like fight that out amongst yourselves, but it really usually isn't that simple. It's more about you have no control over what's going to happen in your life. And there's just some simple number games where like, if there was 8 or 9 of you, the reality of like some of you being more helpful, there's
being able to be more helpful. Absolutely. Yeah.
That's just, and that's just unfortunately not where we're at. And the current administration has kind of shown itself, these government assistance programs, the funding for them may or may not be there.
Oh, yeah, we talked about that on another episode, the one big beautiful bill. As an elder law attorney, I would say it's not so beautiful for older people, particularly long-term care. So when we think about, paying for care, paying for nursing homes, paying for, in some states, what we call a waiver program, where we're waiving the requirement that somebody's in a nursing home to receive funding, those in-home care programs, they're being cut. My own state, Pennsylvania, $20 billion was cut. And so, we think about that's, one of the reasons that facilities aren't being built, because if the funding source is cut off, people aren't going to invest in it. And that has far-reaching ramifications beyond the current administration, because if those things aren't built, they're not there, they're not ready. But, the idea of, as an elder law attorney, long-term care is not covered by Medicare. So if you're listening, most people over 65 are going to get Medicare. That's the insurance we get through the Social Security Administration. But that was made at a time when really acute care was the medical model. So Medicare follows what the care looked like in the 1950s and 1960s, which was I got sick and I either got better or I passed away. There wasn't this long-term care that we see today. And that's, because of the advances of medical, So today we have long-term care. It's not paid for by Medicare. So, people are either using long-term care insurance that they've self-bought, they're self-paying. There is some limited, like up to 100 days in a nursing home under Medicare or Medicaid. And that's the program that's been cut kind of drastically, the funding. Now, the federal government cut it. What it means in every state is going to be different. So the funding is cut to the state. Then every state has to grapple with, how do we answer this question? And for many states, they may get rid of the waivers, which are the in-home care programs, because they're not federally mandated. So if I'm a state and I have a lot less money, I have to make sure I fulfill the federal mandates, which is nursing home care. And so I think when we think about the state of caregiving, we have less caregivers, but we also have less money that's trickling down. And that money could mean individual families don't have access to being able to stay at home, being able to access that care. But it also has ramifications on the industries themselves and how much people are investing in those industries in order to build out the aging network and the caregiving network. And so that's why, as an elder law attorney, I have huge concerns about the future, and why something like this podcast is so important, because to the extent that there isn't something within society, there isn't that aging network, it's just going to fall more on families. And again, I don't want people to think it's not already falling on families, but the future is even more important. And I see it all the time in my office, where people come in and they say they want to plan better for their kids than what they had to deal with their own parents. And I think that's going to be even more and more important moving forward.
I also think, the group of people that it's become more and more important is a group that it was already really hard for, which is solo agers.
Right.
So people that made the decision to be child-free, which is everybody's prerogative to choose to live the life that they want to. But if you...
Well, and I would expand that definition, Court. So almost 20% of people are solo agers. And some of them are people who didn't choose to have children, but also some that I interact with, their children, for whatever reason, aren't in their lives. Right? So they had children, but for whatever reason, and there can be vast different reasons, but 20% of the people that I would interact with, some studies say 17, 18%, but about 1 in 5 people who come to me, and I say to them, who should be your power of attorney? Who should make decisions about your finances and health care if you're not able to? Say to me, I don't know. I don't have somebody. They're solo agers.
Right. And so, for these people, this planning is so important to be done. For anybody, we would say that the planning is important. And, we're not here to scare you into but I think you should be informed, because the reality of it is that we're all going to get old. Well, the hope is that we're all going to get old, right? I don't know. We're in New York City and we're trying to cross the street. So, who knows? But the hope is that we all get old, and so we're all going to age, and so we all have to plan for it. If you're a solo ager, that doesn't mean that you can't. It just takes a little bit more maneuvering. And lots of solo agers have friends or different things like that.
Or siblings. But it's interesting because often those people are their same age.
Yes.
And so hopefully there's a niece or a nephew or somebody else that we think we can rely on. Although I will say, the advice I always give my clients is don't pick somebody based on age. Pick the person that you think can make the best decision, because I think that's the most important thing. I know when I'm dealing with a family in crisis, I sometimes wonder why they picked the people they did, because they don't have decision-making abilities. So I would say to you, in my situation, I want to know if I'm in a crisis, and this goes back to really just a basic step of doing a power of attorney. And that's something everybody on here should do. And if you're caring for somebody, that whoever you're caring for should have a power of attorney. That's a document that says if they're not able to make their own decisions, this is who they want. So it's really important that I know who they wanted me to talk to, who did they trust in this world, because there's always going to be laws in every state that come in and say if they didn't pick somebody, here's who they're going to pick. Maybe a parent or a child, or in a second marriage, children and a step parent, and that can be in an odd sort of way about who gets the votes, in that situation. So really, really important that we know who the person wants to pick, so that we're able to make sure that they can have the care that they wanted, or the decisions that they wanted can be made.
Yeah, and so I think, picking somebody to be your power of attorney, and we did a whole episode on it, and like if you haven't listened, I think it's a really good one to go back and listen to. We talk about like who we picked and why we picked different people. But I think, what I want the listeners to really get from this is that planning is so important, and there's multiple layers to caregiving. And that's, one of the great things, we talked about.
Yeah, caregiving isn't just what you do at the end medically. Yeah. It's the whole journey that gets us there.
It is. And while there's some really scary things happening right now, kind of like in aging in communities in the U.S. kind of as a whole with funding and all of that different stuff, there's also some really great things that like you see come out of it, which is that like these friends that are getting together or siblings that are living together, kind of like the Golden Girls-esque, there are some really neat things that are coming out of this. And I urge people to, rethink about aging in a totally different environment and think about what do they want like the end to look like. I don't know about you, but I had a lot of fun like in my dorm room in college. Like all my friends lived together. We watched The Bachelorette on Monday nights. Like, I don't know, like aging in a house where we're all like living together watching, The Bachelorette or The Golden Bachelor or going on the show ourselves, doesn't sound like the worst way to age. It sounds more fun than, the dingy like nursing home that we all think about where you're eating like gray, whatever. But I think it's just planning for it financially and then planning for it emotionally and, kind of the logistics of all of that, but really thinking about what you want. I also think, we're in a time where there were times where people kind of, you were born in an area, raised in that area, you raised your kids in that area, and people kind of stayed more local. I grew up in North Central Pennsylvania, but I've lived in Boston for the last 11 years. And so there's a whole conversation for me of, I'm not really a solo ager necessarily. One, I'm not 30, so, I'm not an ager.
You're almost,
but I'm not. I am still a couple of months from 30. But caring would be more complicated. My sister's in Connecticut right now. My brother's in Pennsylvania. And there's a thought that, we're not sure. My sister's still in law school, so not sure where she's going to end up. But it does become more complicated. If my goal is to stay in Boston as I age, that becomes a more complicated conversation than, moving back home, with my brother and his fiance. They just got engaged, and I think Liv knows that like I would just like bust on into their like house.
I think she does.
And luckily Liv and I get along really well, and but
she's never lived with you.
That's true. Yeah. And my brother's 8 years younger than I am, so semi helpful that we're not exactly the same age, but who knows what they'll do, if they'll have kids, or what their life will look like 40 years from now.
Yeah, and I think it is important too, I think about, you talk about like the friends and stuff, and I think so your dad's aunt, who I'm power of attorney for right now, she lives in California, and it's amazing to me, like she's a solo ager, never married, but she has a great group of friends, who, every time I go to California now, I always make sure I stop and see her. And, it was her 80th birthday this year, and she was like celebrating for 2 weeks. Like, my family wouldn't have done that much for me probably. Right. But like she was going out. And so, I think in that situation, she is a solo ager, but she had dedicated herself with a really good group of friends. Although interestingly, she went back to family to make, final healthcare and medical decisions and financial decisions. And I think some of that is, her friends could only help for so long because they themselves were her age, and could only give so much. And I appreciate everything that neighbors and friends do, but she certainly had a community of people behind her that was really wonderful. So if you're listening to this, we thank you. This is, real conversations on caregiving, legacy, and love, dedicated to my mom, who we used to walk in and say, "Hey, woman, how you doing?" And so we're hoping that this is just a conversation you can listen to, and you're able to relate to some of what we're saying, maybe get some tidbits of good advice, and just a recognition that what you're doing is hard, and you may not, you may be double guessing yourself at times, but just knowing that you're doing the best you can, and that's all you can do.
And if you're listening and you're looking for more help, more resources, I really urge you to go to planningandprotecting.com. We have a caregiver toolkit that can help you kind of navigate this. We also have connections to attorneys in lots of different states. If, you're not really sure where to go from here, if you need an attorney, I think, most of them offer consultations, or we can get you connected to an attorney in your area if there's not one listed. But I think always reaching out and making sure the foundational information is in place, and seeing what the options are. It's never too early to plan.